Welcome back. So, the 31 players video for today is 31 players you may have forgotten had signed with the team, were playing with the team as we get into next season. And it may very well be fans who maybe didn't pay a whole lot of attention during the offseason. Maybe they've lapsed since March because their 7 teams weren't playing. And there might be a what's this guy doing in our training camp? When did that happen? So there's 31 of those, and then there's one that I couldn't find anybody, so we'll circle back on somebody that people may have forgotten is actually healthy now. So there you go. So we'll start off with, and again, it's Northern Division, Central, Eastern, and Western, and the teams are in their divisions alphabetically. So Calgary, Nikita Nesterov. Nesterov coming back from the KHL. I think he can be useful as a depth defenseman. And it'd be completely... I would totally understand if you'd forgotten that Calgary added Nikita Nesterov. On the Edmonton front, I went with Dominic Cahoon. Now, I know people might say, well, we all know Cahoon went to Edmonton. Do we, though? So, Puljujarvi's coming back. That's getting a lot of attention. And, of course, it's going to be all about how Yamamoto does. You've got Nugent Hopkins on that first line still with McDavid. And you got... It's easy to forget. Oh, and Cahoon. So, I was kind of torn on whether to put him on the board or there were a couple others. But I went with Dominic Cahoon because it may be easily forgotten because of when he signed and how much was going on at the time that he's in Edmonton now. Could be a huge pickup. Montreal, I went with Joel Edmondson. So they traded for Edmondson. They signed him to an extension. Smart move, I believe, anyways. And yeah, we'll see how things go. But again, with Montreal and moves that they've made, and Romanov's coming in and all that, it would be easy to forget Edmondson was coming into that situation and that environment. Ottawa, I went with Austin Watson. So Austin Watson's going to provide them with the same level of sandpaper that they needed up front. That he was providing in Nashville. And yeah, Austin Watson, if you've forgotten he'd gone to Ottawa, again, I would totally understand. Toronto, I went with Joey Anderson. There's a lot being said right now about Thornton, and of course, they added TJ Brody on the blue line, and they've got Aaron Dell as their number 3 goaltender. There are some names that it's kind of easy to remember went there, and you'd be forgiven for forgetting, right, and then Janssen went, and then Joey Anderson was acquired in that trade. And depending on which depth chart you look at, either he's projected to be in their lineup or he might end up on the taxi squad. I know that he's looking forward to playing. He feels very fired up about it. So I hope he makes the team. I think Anderson, if he makes the team and if he's given a decent opportunity, I think he could be a surprise. Vancouver, I went with Jace Hawryluk. So again, not a lot of Canucks that don't get attention from the media, but Jace Hawryluk, I think, solid addition for the Canucks. A risk-free pickup, and we'll see. We'll see whether or not Hawryluk makes the team or if he ends up on the taxi squad. I'm guessing taxi squad. If Höglander makes the team, I'm guessing Jace Hawryluk probably ends up on the taxi squad, but we'll all find out soon. And then for Winnipeg, I went with Nate Thompson. You would be forgiven for thinking, oh, right, Nate Thompson signed in Winnipeg. Yep. And again, depending on the depth chart you look at, either he's 4th line, maybe he's the 13th forward. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, Winnipeg, I went with Nate Thompson. So that's the Canadian. And it's harder with the Canadian teams to find players that fan base are like, well, we knew about. Because, of course, in Canada, it's hockey 365 days a year. It's not just me, it's the country. So we'll move on to the Central. And for Carolina, Vinny Trocheck was picked up at the deadline. You'd be forgiven if you've forgotten Vinny Trocheck was in Carolina. You'd be completely forgiven. Trocheck was not prominent in Carolina after the trade deadline. And in the playoffs, of course, they ended up going out against Boston. But again, Trocheck was not a prominent player there. So if you forgot, you're forgiven for that. Now, for Chicago, I went with Malcolm Subban. Because Subban only played, one game after he went to Chicago? And again, if you've lapsed and haven't been paying much attention, yeah, Subban may end up being the starter. It's possible. Now, it could be Delia, it could be Lankinen. Lankinen's a fascinating one. I want to see how he does. But, yeah, Subban being in Chicago, you would be forgiven if you'd forgotten. With Columbus, Koivu. Koivu playing in Columbus is going to be weird. So not only do we get Koivu with Columbus, we're not going to see him against Minnesota because they're in separate divisions, which is kind of a shame. Koivu, good depth addition, I believe, for Columbus. I think Tortorella's going to like the player a lot. And yeah, we'll see how Koivu does in Columbus after so long in Minnesota. It's not going to look right. They're not going to pretend it looks right. But again, forgiven if you've forgotten. Dallas, Mark Pysyk. So Pysyk added for Dallas. I think that's a solid addition for them. He can play defense. He can play on the wing. He's not going to be a high-profile guy. He doesn't score a bunch of points and goals, but he's useful. And I think that kind of utility player can be underrated at times. With Detroit, Vlad Nemestikov. If you'd forgot that Vladislav Nemestikov had signed in Detroit, great. So, again, this is all about finding players that may have been traded, may have been signed, in this case signed. And it looks like Detroit, with Yzerman, it should be a slow build, gradual build. And adding Nemestikov is about having depth. And I do expect Detroit to be mildly better this year than last season. I don't expect leaps and bounds from them, but I do expect things to be better. And I think a signing like Nemestikov shows that, yeah, Yzerman wants things to be a little bit better too. Not playoffs necessarily, but at least better. For Florida, I had forgotten Patrick Hornqvist was traded to Florida. So when I was going through and reading up all the depth charts going into this video, I was like, yeah, Hornqvist. Right. He's in Florida. It's just going to look weird. Hornqvist in Florida. So, yeah, he's been moved. Mark Borowiecki being in Nashville. Borowiecki, I think, is one of those guys who should have stayed in Ottawa. And there aren't very many guys who stay in Ottawa. And I don't say that as any sort of insult towards Ottawa. It's just, if you think about their team's history, guys almost always leave. Even Alfredson at the end ends up leaving. So, Borowiecki being in Nashville, it's going to look weird. And it's just because I'm surprised he didn't stay in Ottawa. Now, for Tampa, I went with Andreas Borgman. Andreas Borgman added as a depth blue liner. They lost some depth in the offseason. We'll see whether or not he actually makes the roster as a number 7 defenseman, whether or not he ends up being of any consequence for them. But again, if you're looking at the roster and you're saying, Borgman, yeah, exactly. So we go to the East. And in Boston, here's the thing. Nick Ritchie's still a Bruin. I had not expected that. I thought it was a disaster after he came over from Anaheim. I thought that his play in the playoffs was not great either. And so I had kind of half expected, while everybody else was saying, oh, Tuukka Rask is going to be gone, Tuukka Rask is going to be gone. I thought Nick Ritchie was going to be gone. But Boston, he's still there. And we'll see whether or not he plays the whole season in Boston. We'll see if he can bounce back from what was just disastrous for him in his first go-around with the Bruins last season. For Buffalo, Cody Eakin. So while everybody's talking about Taylor Hall, and understandably so, and all the young guys, now the young guys are all going to come together and all of that wonderful stuff. Cody Eakin, you'd be forgiven for not realizing Cody Eakin had gone there. I thought about Toby Reeder too, but I thought, I'll throw Cody Eakin on the board because, again, I think there are those who may forget Eakin's there. Ryan Murray going to New Jersey. That was a cap move by Columbus, as Columbus made room for all these free agents they wanted to sign, and then they didn't. But the thought was there. Ryan Murray's contract in New Jersey, less problematic than it was for Columbus. And as long as Murray can stay healthy, that's really the key, right? As long as Murray can stay healthy, and then you kind of just leave it at that. He can be a very useful defenseman. So, again, New Jersey, we'll see whether or not he's able to play the full 56 for them, or if he plays 50, how many he plays. For the Islanders, Andy Green is back. Andy Green's re-signed. Of course, he's considered to be a Devil by most, and rightfully so. A New Jersey Devil for a very long time. And so seeing him in an Islanders jersey might feel a little bit odd. And then him going back to the Islanders as a UFA, that's also a little bit odd. So if you didn't realize, it's understandable. The Rangers, Jack Johnson. Here's the thing. So the New York Rangers always seem to have that one defenseman that the fan base gets mad at. I remember at times hearing that about Shea before he was moved, Pionk before he was moved, and Stahl before. And again, it's just, if you're a Rangers defenseman, odds are at some point the fan base is going to get mad. Now they bring in Jack Johnson. And I remember thinking at the time they signed him, I thought they're not even trying anymore. They just went, okay, we need a guy that the fans are going to turn on so the other defensemen don't have that pressure. Why don't we get Jack Johnson? That's brilliant. All right, guys, we'll wrap it up. Hopefully Jack has a bounce back year for the Rangers. I mean that. He proved there was one really good year in there. Since this channel started, there was one really good year, and it's been kind of a mixed bag since then. Philadelphia, Eric Gustafsson. So Gustafsson was a rental for the Flames. I was kind of surprised the Flames didn't keep him. I thought they'd find a way to keep him, and something would happen there. But no, Gustafsson now is in Philadelphia. So all the best to him. In Philly, and for Pittsburgh, who of course didn't decide to keep Jack Johnson and actually has a buyout, right? Mark Jankowski, that's a whole other thing. Remember when guys got bought out? Right. Oh, yeah, right. So Mark Jankowski is in Pittsburgh. That could end up being a good pickup for them. And I know his time in Calgary had really come to an unceremonious end. But he's still young enough that he can turn things around. And playing in Pittsburgh, you just never know. Sometimes, again, with Pittsburgh, sometimes they will have that bounce. Sometimes they don't. But Jankowski, we'll see whether or not his numbers come back up to reasonable. And I don't mean like he's not going to go out there and score 17 in a 56-game schedule. He's not going to score his career high or anything. But if you got like 8 or 9 goals, that would be considered a victory for him. Washington, Trevor Van Riemsdyk. Depth on the blue line. Again, easy to forget that he's now in Washington. And he's kind of bounced around the league a bit. So we go to the Western Division, and what really inspired this, and this was talked about in yesterday's Patreon live stream. So every Monday we have a Patreon live stream. And very often when we have those, and they're very small, there's like about 20 people in the live stream usually as the peak. There's stuff that'll get said during those live streams that I think, okay, we could do a video on that. And I'd been wanting to do this video. And when somebody in the chat says, I'd forgotten David Backes was part of the Anaheim Ducks. And I had thought the same thing earlier that day. I realized this was the next 31 and 31 I had to do. Because, yeah, David Backes is a member of the Ducks. Easy to forget, and yet he's there. And we'll see whether or not Backes ends up playing on, say, the third. Probably the fourth line, but maybe the third. Backes, at times in Boston, it looked like he had his mojo back a little bit, and then it would just fall off again. So hopefully he does. I like Backes. I know that he's nearing the end, but it would be nice to see him have some kind of a bounce back with Anaheim. And for Arizona, Tyler Pitlick. You'd be forgiven for forgetting that Tyler Pitlick is now a member of the Arizona Coyotes. Again, useful depth guy. Not a huge difference maker when it comes to the goals and the assists and all that stuff, but good depth guy. For Colorado, Dennis Gilbert. Again, Dennis Gilbert, depth defenseman. He ends up in Colorado. We'll see how many games he gets to play this year. But it was one of those moves that when I saw it made way back, all the way back when that happened, all right, I guess that's okay. And again, they would know Gilbert well from playing against Chicago when they were in the same division. So there you go. For LA, this is where I kind of threw in a guy that people may not realize is healthy now, Gabriel Velarde. So Velarde played 10 games last year at the end of the LA Kings season before the pause. He had 7 points. He looked very, very good. So Velarde is penciled into a pretty prominent role with the Kings coming into this season. We'll see whether or not he ends up there or if he ends up in a more depth role. Because again, it's going to depend on how other guys play as to whether or not he ends up on the second or the third line. But Velarde played very well. And at some point, it's quite possible this guy gets a Kings jersey with Velarde's name on the back because he also wears the number 42. So that makes a difference too. But hey, Velarde, Kings lineup, and we'll see this year. He's still technically a rookie. He could end up, if he gets off to a fast start, if he gets the right ice time, if he gets special teams, he could end up being a dark horse for the Calder. Nick Bonino being with Minnesota. It's weird. So in the offseason, Bill Guerin decided to revamp the center spot in Minnesota, and Nick Bonino's part of that. And we'll see how that goes. It's just weird because when you make a trade with Nashville, who they're normally in the same division as, you're making trades with a division rival. There's some risk to that, and I'm not sure that I understand again, I'm trying to figure out what Bill Guerin's master plan is here, and I guess we'll see when the season starts how good these moves are, how well they're going to work, but we'll find out soon. San Jose, Ryan Donato, who was traded from Minnesota, and he was traded with Dubnyk. So if you'd forgotten Dubnyk, there's a bonus name for you. But Ryan Donato being in San Jose, we're up to the point now where if it doesn't work in San Jose, he officially is bouncing around the league. So he's gone from Boston to Minnesota now. Now he's in San Jose. If it doesn't work, then he's bounced around the league. And so I hope Donato finds a home with San Jose and that it clicks. He shows you that offensive ability, but then it disappears for a while. And I know there were complaints in Minnesota about him not getting enough ice time from some fans. It's the same complaint I saw in Boston. I remember in Boston when they demoted him to the minors, there were Bruins fans that were mad about it. He is one of those guys that you will say, why isn't he getting more ice time? You'd have to ask his coaches. You'd have to ask the GMs. We'll see whether or not that changes with San Jose. San Jose, a team that could use some goal scoring if Donato shows that he can get that back, and if he can get that consistency up, could end up being a steal if you're in one of those fantasy drafts that does the whole depth, like through the league kind of thing. Kyle Clifford for St. Louis. If you've forgotten, Clifford signed with St. Louis. You've now been reminded. Brings a little bit of toughness to that bottom six for St. Louis. And to close it out, for Vegas, I went with Dylan Sakura. Dylan Sakura goes from being a depth guy with the Hawks to being a depth guy for Vegas. And we'll see how things go for him. I like Sakura. I hopefully he's able to earn himself maybe a fourth line spot, but he may end up being the 13th forward. We'll see. So there you go. In the comment section below, I want you to tell me a player who, when you've seen them in training camp on a roster, you said, I forgot that guy was there. And it could be this year, it could be a previous year, that kind of thing. Let me know what you guys think. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.